Why were we fighting the Second World War from 1941 onwards, 42 onwards? What about Dieppe? Why were we helping the Russians to invade Europe? And why were we defeating the one man who was prepared to put up a Bolshevik against the Russians, Adolf Hitler? We told ourselves that we were fighting the devil incarnate. He did all that to the Jews, therefore it was right that we should do everything we can, whatever the cost, in order to defeat him. Well, even this turns out to be untrue, because there is not the slightest evidence that Adolf Hitler knew whatever was happening about the Jews, about the Holocaust, about Auschwitz. I've offered again and again £1,000 English money, 2,000 Canadian dollars, to any historian or private person or institute. I've made this offer in 1977. I've made it ever since over the last 9 years, in television programs, the media, all the way around the world. £1,000 to anybody who can find one wartime document showing that Adolf Hitler even knew about Auschwitz or about whatever was going on the Eastern Front in that particular historical region. And they can't find it, and they huff and they puff, and they all look at each other, all these academic historians, and they say, Jekyll, you got the proof somewhere, haven't you? And Jekyll says, no, I haven't got it. Hilgruber has it. And Hilgruber says, no, I haven't got it. Jacobson has it. And Jacobson says, but I quoted Brochard. And Brochard says, but I thought you had it, Jekyll. And so they go round and round. They all thought that the other person had the evidence, and because they can't prove that they've got the evidence, they all round on me and say, Irving is a fascist, don't believe him, he's discredited. Nobody accepts what he's got. Well, I've come up in the archives with a whole string of documents which goes even further than this. Genuine documents that meet my criteria, genuine documents written by people in a position to know, documents that have been created not for some exterior or ulterior motive. Genuine documents, a string of documents, a narrow file of documents showing Hitler deliberately, explicitly linked to the Holocaust, as we can say, or linked to the fate of the Jews, that great tragedy. And all these documents show Hitler intervening, trying to stop anything nasty happening to the Jews. There's not one single document showing the other direction of Hitler whipping up the murderers and saying, do this, do that, you're not working hard enough. And I'm going to quote a few examples to you. They're in my book on Hitler, the Hitler's War, or the Warpath. The first one is November the 10th, 1938, the famous Night of Broken Glass. Night of Broken Glass, you remember the Reichskristallnacht, the great anti-Jewish pogrom that began on that day. 1,000 Jewish shops were burned down, homes were looted, synagogues were burned down, 150 of them, 60 or 70 Jews were actually murdered. The first that Hitler knew, as I know because I've spoken to all his private staff, was when he got a telephone call that evening at 2:30 in the morning from a hotel in Munich, downtown, saying the Führer's adjutants ought really to come and pick up their baggage from the hotel because a synagogue has just been set on fire next to the hotel. And Hitler's pricked up his ears. He said, what's going on? What the hell is going on? He sends his adjutants, these 6 men, out of their beds. He sends them out into the streets of Munich that night to try and protect individual Jewish shops or businesses that he knows might be at risk. And he calls in his ministers, Goebbels, Hess and the others, and he has them all night in his residence sending out telegrams all night to stop the madness. And one of them I quote, and I printed actually as a facsimile in my book, The Warpath, the 10th of November 1938, on the headed notepaper of Rudolf Hess himself, that man who is a war criminal now in Spandau for the rest of his life, 46 years in prison already. Rudolf Hess sends out a 3-line message that night. Instruction number 172/1938 to all Gauleiters, to all the Nazi officials throughout Germany, on express instructions from the very highest level. Well, Hess is number 2, so this can only be the number 1 man himself. On express instructions from the very highest level, there are to be no outrages or acts of arson whatsoever under any circumstances against the Jewish community or Jewish property. An attempt to stop the madness that has already begun somehow. Nobody is quite sure how it began. But you won't find this document quoted anywhere else except in my book. I found this document, let me say, in the files of the American government in Berlin, the Berlin Document Center. It's a genuine document, there's no denying it, yet you won't find it quoted anywhere. And I'll quote another document to you while I'm about it, because it shows even more graphically that everything that's been said about Adolf Hitler and his part in the Holocaust is probably a load of rubbish. This is the spring of 1942. In the spring of 1942, there's this document, which is in the files of the German Ministry of Justice. It's only a small memorandum, an Aktennotiz, signed by the Deputy German Minister of Justice, Hitler's Minister of Justice, for his own files. And it records a telephone conversation from a man called Hans Lammers, the Reichsminister, the head of the German civil service, like a prime minister in a dictatorship, the spring of 1942. Reichsminister Hans Lammers informs me that the Führer, that's Adolf Hitler, has repeatedly declared to him that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. Now, how do you climb out of that one if you're an established historian in a university today? You can't explain it because you're going around telling everyone that Hitler's the man who ordered the killing of the Jews. Hitler ordered the final solution, and yet here's the only document actually linking Hitler and the solution of the Jewish problem with Hitler putting out his hand saying, I want it all postponed, this solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. It raises a whole host of questions, this document. They can't answer it, so you know what they do? They drop it on the floor. They pretend it doesn't exist, and they put their foot on it like a card sharp. They pretend this document doesn't exist. You won't find that document quoted in any of the official histories or in any of the histories around the world. It's a document that just doesn't exist unless you read my book on Adolf Hitler. And it's not the only two, those ones I quoted you. There's a whole string of documents beginning in 1923, the famous Beer Hall Putsch, the evidence given in the trial on that night about how Hitler was overheard talking about the Jews in private, and he found out that night on November the 8th, 1923, that Hitler had heard from a policeman who gave evidence in the Hitler trial a few weeks later. This policeman said, I overheard Adolf Hitler being told that one of the Nazi units had gone berserk in downtown Munich and had ransacked a Jewish shop and had stolen all its property. And Hitler ordered the commander of that unit into his presence, stripped him of all his unit badges and insignia, threw him out of the Nazi party on the spot, and also ordered him to produce a list of all the names of his unit, and he said, neither you nor any member of your unit will ever again be accepted in a patriotic organization. I personally will take care of that. You have brought the entire movement into discredit. That was back in 1923, and it goes right through to 1944, all this string of documents, which you won't see quoted anywhere else, because it doesn't fit in with the romantic notion, the Hollywood legend, the Madison Avenue legend, the one which we fought the Second World War over, if we now look back in hindsight on that ghastly tragedy. What did we fight the war for? Not very much remains then, once we remove the Holocaust and Hitler's personal role. I'm convinced, let me make this quite plain so any media present are not going to misquote me on this, I'm convinced that there was a ghastly tragedy of sorts in the Eastern Front. I'm convinced that this tragedy was perpetrated by a large number of mean-minded, bloodthirsty murderers operating independently without orders from above. They carried it out for the meanest of motives, either out of bloodlust or because they wanted to rob the victims or wherever. And it is the kind of thing that regrettably happens in major wars. It happened in the Vietnam War. You've only got to look at the case of Lieutenant Calais and My Lai, and I'm sure that the American public would be deeply indignant if anyone was to say you are to blame for Lieutenant Calais and My Lai, except, of course, in the broadest kind of sense that their media, their journalism, their television and so on had created the kind of morals which make a My Lai possible. Because, of course, My Lai in the Vietnam War was also a kind of race war, the white Superman against the yellow men, the Gooks, or whatever the Viet Cong were called. But, of course, this is unfashionable to say this, because the whole media, even now for various reasons, is focused exclusively on World War II and the devil incarnate, which is why we British had to fight him and why we are proud now to be bankrupt. This is basically the story of the Second World War. The biggest lie of the 20th century is that we had no alternative but to fight the Second World War because we were fighting the devil incarnate. And I've given you the examples. I've looked at the Holocaust, I've looked at the Jewish problem, and I've offered one simple yardstick, the whole simple question of poison gas, to make a comparison between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill. In short, I think that Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt, Stalin, all these great leaders in the Second World War were roughly much of a muchness when it comes to their criminality. Something comes over people when they get power. There have been various ways expressed of how it is. Something comes over them. A criminal edge overcomes them. They put themselves above normal law, and I don't think Hitler was any more or any less than any of the other ones, and it has to be said, and he was not worth squandering an entire empire over. And that has to be said. The biggest lie of the 20th century was that.